Hi, I'm Donal Keenan. I'm the awards director here at D&AD. I'm in conversation today with Donna Payne, who is the jury president this year for book design. Hello, Donna. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, Donal. I'm good, thanks. Yeah, fine. And I'm creative director at Faber Faber. We're and still proudly independent as a publisher, and I work across all areas of publishing, design, and trade books, including sort of fiction, non-fiction, rock and pop, children's, poetry, and an arts list.
Amazing. Such an amazing career. So you've been working in the book design field for a very, very long time now, I believe. Is that correct?
25 years. And I've been at Faber for 15, amazingly.
Amazing. So you were jury president on the book design jury this year. What was that like?
It was great. It was really brilliant to kind of be out in an open space with other creatives after a period of lockdown. That made everyone, I think, extra excited about the process. And even though we've all kind of been very immersed in looking at visuals on screen, it was actually just really lovely to sort of get together with a group of people who've been sort of working in a similar way and kind of look at other people's work, because I think we've all adapted so brilliantly to sort of working from home this year that it was really lovely to kind of, to some extent, sort of realise sort of what we've been missing and looking at those sort of physical sort of examples of work and kind of, that lovely sort of collaborative sort of discussion around them. So, yeah, it was really, really good. Everyone was really excited about the process, which is great. And we were looking at brilliant work, so it made it very easy.
Sure. Talking about brilliant work, like in book design, in your opinion, what does make something brilliant? What excites you about it?
Well, I mean, I find it endlessly sort of fascinating that as book designers, we kind of work within a similar format in slightly varying sizes and continue to kind of come up with something new and fresh kind of all the time, and I think that was the great thing about this year, is that we really did see a really lovely sort of broad reach in terms of the work that was submitted. I'd kind of judged in this category probably about sort of 6 years ago, and it was much more focused. There's much more of a focus on art books, and it kind of felt sort of very much about high production values. It felt kind of very serious. I loved kind of how much humour kind of came through, and kind of some of the concepts that came through in the work this year. I also loved just the kind of it just felt much more international. It felt like it was work that was kind of pushing the boundaries sort of, conceptually. And and it was just a real pleasure. I think we could have spent twice as much time as we did sort of judging, just out of the sort of sheer delight of looking at such lovely work.
Sure. You mentioned some international work there. Like, what are the challenges sometimes when a group of judges comes to that and kind of looks at more international work sometimes?
I think where there's a sort of a language barrier, where we literally can't read the books. It's and that's often with work sort of from the Far East and sort of China, where we're sort of slightly more reliant on kind of descriptions and just it's much more of a kind of a focus, I suppose, on the actual sort of design of the work. That's kind of quite nice in some ways, because you really are kind of purely looking at the design, and actually if the design's working really, really hard, you can kind of get a good sort of gist of sort of what the concept behind it was and kind of why it's sort of so strong. And so sometimes that can be sort of quite a nice thing, where you're just purely looking at sort of finishes, attention to detail. And there's a lovely, lovely example of that with a book by sort of Jia Hui, who which was a book of kind of gorgeous, it was a history of botanical illustration. And we were all just kind of mesmerised by this book and said everybody wants to own it, just because it was just so beautiful, just so beautifully done. And, you know, every turn of the page was kind of a delight. And it took what could have been sort of quite a dry, sort of serious subject, which was this history of botanical art, and just turned it into kind of something fresh and original. And it was just really, really lovely.
Great. Talking about some of the work, was there anything else that really stood out from the start when you jumped into the judging process?
I think the variety is still the thing that kind of sticks out for me. It was really great to see some really strong entries in the area of sort of trade design. So, you know, what I would refer to that whole sort of ground floor of a bookshop. So kind of just made most, you know, those books that were kind of very focused on sort of covers, quite commercial design. There was a really beautiful series of books designed by David Pearson with copy by sort of Nick Asprey that really stood out for me, in that it was a series of books that was it was a redesign of the John le Carré books, and it was a redesign of early John le Carré, and it was a brief that could have very easily kind of slipped into sort of pastiche, but it didn't at all. It kind of took kind of some of the nuances of design sort of from kind of sort of the late 60s and sort of, well, late 50s, early 60s, and kind of just turned it into something new and fresh and original. And it was lovely. I always love seeing collaboration in design, and the collaboration between designer and copywriter was just superb on those books. And it was a very, very simple concept, just beautifully executed. And yeah, it was really, really great to see. Really great to see kind of outstanding series design.
Great. You touched on copywriting there. Can you recall any work where the copy really elevated the design, as in like absolutely made it leaps and bounds better, just from a single word?
I think certainly the copywriting on the John le Carré books redesign was superb, because I think kind of copy and blurb on sort of book jackets is often sort of overlooked, when, you know, for me, you know, my job as a designer is to kind of get you to pick up the book, but then, you know, it's the role of the copywriter to absolutely kind of make you sort of, you know, confirm that this title is what you think it is and what you want it to be, and for you to kind of pick it up, purchase it, and take it home. And so, you know, it's staggeringly sort of important in the industry. But I thought there were some beautiful examples of great copywriting in across all of our kind of pencil winners. So I'd say sort of on a history of gun crime, there was some beautiful copywriting in there, just in terms of introducing you to the book and what it was and why it was important. There was some lovely kind of humour coming through on a project which was sort of telling the story of a family through sort of a dining chair. And the kind of visual aspect of that was all kind of designed from the 50s and 60s sort of packaging and magazine design. And just all the copy kind of felt very much sort of its time as well. But actually there was kind of really a very, very sort of clever sort of story kind of sort of leading you through what was actually something that was incredibly high concept, but very, very fun.
Ooh. Kind of talking about some amazing work there, was there anything that fundamentally surprised you? You know, just like, you know, from your kind of long history and working in book design, that actually really took you back and was like, wow, look at that.
I suppose what did surprise me was that I think when I've kind of looked at categories previously, those kind of titles that were sort of promotional. So, for example, there's a promotional project for sort of Durex that kind of actually had kind of quite a strong sort of message behind it about sort of identity and acceptance. And And it was just incredibly well done. It didn't feel disposable in the way that often promotional kind of books can. It felt like something that you would keep and something that you would read, and it had kind of real impact, even though, you know, the finishes were glorious, the kind of the packaging was really strong. But it was definitely a book that with substance. It felt like a real book and not like a promotional sort of piece of sort of marketing.
Yeah, like a throwaway piece of design.
Yeah.
Oh, great. You mentioned there was a lot of humor coming through. Was there any other main kind of themes or trends that you saw coming through the work?
I think what was great about this year was that, you know, concepts were kind of very sort of evident. There was no sort of style. There was very, very little sort of style over substance. There were, you know, there was definitely kind of humor, but definitely there was, you know, the one of the books that kind of stood out for us was, you know, History of Gun Crime, which obviously kind of, you know, picked up on sort of what's happening in the news right now, some of the themes kind of following sort of Black Lives Matter, and that kind of took a book and kind of, you know, I suppose it kind of, you know, it used the form. It definitely couldn't have happened. It took the format of a book and kind of used it to deliver a very, very serious message. And it took the physicality of a book. The book was kind of shot through with a bullet, and it's literally called The Book That Stopped a Bullet. And so it was kind of, even though the content was very, very strong on that title, there was just definitely something about the sort of physicality of it. It couldn't have been anything other than a book that kind of made it sort of quite outstanding, sort of in its category. And, you know, it's the reason why it kind of deserved its sort of black pencil, was that it was, you know, it was a book, but it was so much more.
Yeah, touching on, obviously, massive congratulations to the team behind it, obviously picking up the first black pencil in book design for several decades.
Yeah.
I know obviously you touched on kind of why it rose up the ranks there, you know, talking about all of the elements to that, you know, fundamentally the concept obviously was very strong, but what about the design? Was that really living up to it as well?
The design was absolutely living up to it, and it was one of the projects that we, you know, it wasn't an immediately unanimous decision, but it was definitely, I think you always know you've got a pencil winner when the jury are kind of still debating it, sort of, you know, 10, 15 minutes after the conversation's begun, and everyone feels incredibly strongly. I've always said, you know, really great design is design that evokes a response, you know, whether that's really good or really bad. You know, it really has to kind of challenge, I think, and sort of create debate. And that was one book that really, really did, because some of the jury members initially kind of wondered whether actually it was overly simple a concept, that this idea of a book that had been shot through with a bullet was kind of in some ways perhaps just kind of a little sort of slight, or just a kind of a trick that had been used before. But the more we thought about it, the more we looked at the book and thought about how, well, if it hadn't been shot through with this bullet, would it still work as a great piece of design? And we all agreed, yes, it would, because the typography was brilliant. The use of colour inside was great. The kind of the whole sort of span of kind of history from sort of the late 1800s to sort of present day was really kind of very, very well done. It had been very well thought through and designed. And I think kind of, you know, even kind of putting the book aside and looking at the supporting material and all the layouts, it was still a really, really beautiful book. So it would have worked in ebook, but it wouldn't have kind of had the same impact, because also the physicality of the book kind of made all the difference. And I think that's what we always strive for in book design, is when we're kind of thinking about finishes, when we're thinking about those extra concepts that kind of take a book design from great to excellent, or, you know, something that we want to evoke a feeling or appeal to a certain market, you know, fundamentally has to work as a piece of design in its own right, has to look brilliant on screen, but also kind of taking it into a different place in its physical form is kind of where design, you know, book design becomes like really excellent, I think.
You mentioned obviously debate around that work. Was there any other big reactions, debates, or even unanimous decisions with some other work?
I don't think so. I think I think there were those books where I think we discussed for sort of pencil. There was kind of definitely a sort of a large agreement. There were definitely those titles that really stood out. Probably the history of sort of botanical illustration. There are a couple of people who it didn't sort of appeal to in terms of a readership, I suppose. But I think that everyone just agreed that it was kind of stunning. And I think the lack of, that's maybe because there was so much sort of concept-driven work, the fact that this was just an incredibly beautiful book felt somehow challenging. I think just really because we were so spoiled by kind of, you know, all of these sort of dizzying ideas. And I suppose it took a while for us to kind of really let ourselves kind of give a pencil to something that was just, you know, outstandingly beautiful, and, you know, well thought through.
Yeah, cool. You touched on e-publications there, just when you were talking about the gun violence history book. There wasn't a huge amount of entries in that area, but just kind of talking about, you know, what makes brilliant design when it comes to e-publications. Obviously, a lot of people are reading books digitally. There's still obviously the beauty and the love for a physical book. Do you work quite a lot with digital publications yourself? And, you know, like, how do you approach making, you know, the design kind of wondrous and beautiful in a digital space?
I think we're still always kind of thinking about the physical book sort of first and foremost. But if a book design sort of relies on finishes, it's something we'll kind of stop and kind of give pause for thought in terms of, you know, the fact that it really does need to work sort of on screen and in a digital space too. Sometimes what we'll do, rather than kind of compromising the end design, we'll just sort of adapt kind of the final design if it relies heavily on finish, and so that there's kind of a strong visual that gives a good idea of kind of, you know, the sort of end effect. Increasingly, we'll supply sort of supporting material, and we'll kind of photograph the final book or photograph a mock-up and kind of, you know, supply that for sort of readers to sort of look at. I think the important thing is that we've never kind of compromised on design with the kind of the digital kind of format in mind, I suppose. So yes, I think naturally as designers, increasingly when we're looking at a visual, we'll reduce it down to kind of postage stamp size and kind of check that it works, you know, check that it is sort of legible. But I think that's something we're doing very, very naturally now. It used to be something that we would physically do and sort of check, but now when we're designing, I think it's become sort of second nature to think of it as being promoted in that space.
Okay. And obviously we've had an unprecedented year, as in that word has been overused, but you know, it is true and accurate. The pandemic obviously is still happening and going, but like through your process this year, where you're working, has there been any noticeable effects on the way you're designing, your processes, your ways of working?
I think, I think there's been a quite a big change, but I think we've adapted. I think all creatives have adapted brilliantly, actually, from the conversations I've had. Book publishing is very collaborative. We get together in small teams all the time when we're back in the office with sales, marketing, editorial, design. And of course, it's just a little more sort of difficult to do that. I think, though, it's kind of had some interesting effects. I think sort of sending a new visual around to kind of the cover team via email has made people kind of just sort of sit with the design for a little bit longer and kind of maybe sort of think a little more before they kind of give feedback on the design. I think kind of those people's whose voices are maybe not so strong in a group meeting setting have kind of, risen up. It's been a great time for introverts. I think we've kind of heard from some people kind of more than others that maybe kind of, were not heard kind of quite so much before. I don't know, there's kind of just been kind of quite a nice sort of egalitarian sort of switch, I think, in terms of everyone's voice kind of feeling kind of a little more sort of equal when it comes to sort of talking about design. And I think it's just made us kind of just consider the process a little bit more when we're kind of judging work, I suppose.
Great. Just kind of talking a little bit about D&AD's mission. Obviously, D&AD exists obviously to stimulate and inspire the next generation of emerging talent. And I know you've been involved with D&AD in other capacities in our other programs as well. But what would your advice be for the next generation of designers? I know they're coming out through universities and up through, just into creative teams in a very challenging time. Is there any advice that you could give to them?
I think my advice would be, and it's been interesting because it's been, I'm involved in several sort of mentorship programs, and it's been really interesting while we've all been working at home, some of the conversations I've had with sort of my mentees, because I think it's been, young sort of creatives are often, learning from more experienced creatives, kind of, in the context of a sort of an office setting. And so I think, it's been sort of harder for young creatives to kind of really kind of push the boundaries because they're not really sure kind of what they're pushing against, I suppose. But I suppose my advice would be to kind of just keep pushing those boundaries of what's possible. Following kind of Black Lives Matter sort of initiatives this year, I think as well, just kind of recognise that other sort of cultures have sort of different viewpoints, get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable when you're sort of talking about work. And I've always kind of said that sort of discomfort will tell you everything about where you need to go next with a project. I think kind of feeling uncomfortable when you're looking at your design work or others' design work often kind of tells you you're either being challenged, or if it's your own work, your instincts are telling you that it could be sort of pushed much further. So I suppose it's kind of trust your instincts, but keep listening and learning from others, really.
Great. Fingers crossed the jobs market will come back and that generation can get into the creative world. But, we don't know what's going to happen. So fingers crossed we can support in what ways we can.
Yeah, there's some great talent out there still kind of coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. Just talking a little bit about D&AD as well, why do you think it's important? Why do you think the pencil is important? And what does it mean to you, to the industry?
I think it sort of remains that kind of shorthand for sort of excellence in the industry. And I think that's terribly important. There are kind of so many sort of mixed messages and information coming through and across a bewildering range of kind of platforms, and kind of the clarity of kind of what it means to earn a pencil is kind of really reassuring, I think, and sort of just really sort of simple way of kind of telling people that, I suppose it is a symbol of kind of hard work, excellence, and success, I would say. I think the judging process around kind of a D&AD pencil is kind of thorough, collaborative, well thought through. I think if you've won a pencil, you know that your work's really been looked at, and it wasn't an easy decision, and that the judges took their role kind of very seriously in awarding it.
Great. You touched on the judging process there, as in, what were your expectations? As in, did it kind of meet those, or is there any actual kind of surprises in there as well?
I think judging for D&AD is just always fun. It's always inspiring. I think no matter how experienced you are in the industry, just kind of being inspired by others' work is something that never ever sort of stops. And it's a really kind of lovely sort of point in the year to be sort of reminded of the huge sort of wealth of talent there is kind of out there. It's a reminder to kind of look beyond sort of design sort of within the UK, and realize that that those different perspectives across the globe are relevant, and and it's I think that's really, really sort of important to sort of recognize. And I feel like D&AD has always kind of recognized that, whereas kind of there are some other sort of organizations who are only just about sort of getting to that realization that thinking globally is essential.
Sure. Obviously, I was managing the judging process this year and organising all of the various different component parts, and we had to reschedule book design a couple of times, as in, obviously, because it was my firm belief that we had to do it in person, as in it was very, I think, judging books virtually is quite difficult. So I was, rearranged it a couple of times. Thankfully, the lockdown was lifted and we could get you all together. But do you think it would be even ever possible to properly judge book design digitally?
I think, in the area I work in mostly is book jackets, and book jackets really do have to work on their kind of front cover merit. And because obviously many are sold kind of, across kind of a digital platform. So in the area of trade design, absolutely. I would almost say that, a book jacket that doesn't work digitally in trade has probably failed really to deliver. But I think in terms of kind of fully illustrated books, picture books, art books, it is really essential to kind of really kind of be in the presence of the object. Certainly for our Black Pencil winner, the physicality of it was absolutely essential to its success, I would say, as a Black Pencil winner. The fact that it was a huge book with a bullet shot through that sort of almost felt like a torso, that was its size and sort of shape, was the thing that kind of really sort of blew you away about that piece. Yes, it was very, very strong digitally too. Supporting material meant that, good supporting material meant that idea sort of came across, but you really did have to kind of feel kind of its presence to really kind of know sort of the impact of kind of turning pages that had been sort of destroyed by a bullet, to fully get the impact of that particular winner.
There was an interesting entry that was in a box, and beautiful little pieces. It was quite unconventionally a book. How do you actually define what a book is?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I suppose there were a few projects like that. I think there was a book about tampon tax that was a book, but it was also a box, and the whole idea of that was that actually if you were kind of selling tampons within a book, there would be no VAT. I mean, that was an incredibly strong concept. We did actually debate as a jury for a long time whether it was actually a book. And I think that the dining chair project as well, that came in a box. That was definitely a piece of packaging. Also, I think the Durex promotional piece as well, that kind of literally came in a big sort of vacuum packed sort of Durex packet. They all kind of ended up being books. They didn't all start that way. Some of them were kind of, packaged in boxes first. But I think I love that. I love the idea that we can kind of stretch beyond our sort of definitions of a book. We're kind of all very, very used to kind of a B format or a kind of larger format sort of title for art books. So it's good to be sort of surprised by that, I think. And as long as it's kind of something that, where you're at some point turning pages and absorbed by it, it's probably a book.
Where do you think kind of book design is moving towards? Are there any trends that might emerge this year that we could see in the awards next year?
Well, I think kind of, being in a period of lockdown and not having sort of access to bookshops or perhaps, because as book designers, we're often designing a year or more in advance. We've all been in a situation where we've had to think about the very real possibility of a book selling in a digital space only, and sort of not having the sort of the luxury of kind of, being able to browse in a bookshop. Similarly, budgets have been, cut, of course. Everyone's kind of making cuts to their sort of budgets when it comes to sort of production. So we're having to think very, very carefully about how we use finishes at the moment. And I think that will only spurn sort of creativity. I think book designers in particular are brilliant at being given a few kind of constraints and being asked to design within them. And they're able to kind of come up with sort of very, very sort of brilliant solutions. So I expect to see some brilliant solutions to budget cuts. Which is very, very possible. And also I think kind of books that are maybe in some way kind of flexing their muscle more powerfully digitally, without the physical book to sort of rely on. So yeah, I think there'll definitely be a few surprises.
Okay. So we have the first Black Pencil winner for roughly 40 years in book design. What do you think it would take for something to win a Black Pencil again next year?
In book design, well, I think it would have to surpass kind of the Black Pencil winner from this year, very definitely, or equal it. I think it would have to be equally kind of strong in its message, equally surprising and simple in its execution. I'd love there to be another Black Pencil winner in books next year, and I hope there will be. I hope kind of this Black Pencil winner sort of inspires and sort of excites kind of others to use books as a vehicle for social change, in order to kind of deliver a very, very sort of powerful message.
A well-deserved win, and well done for getting it over the line. I think we might leave it there, but thank you very much for talking to me today, Donna. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really great to see you again.